Sword to podcast. Welcome to Dear Watchers, an omniversal comic book podcast where we do a deep dive into the multiverse.
We are you from Eternia to Etheria and through the stories and worlds that make up an omniverse of fictional realities we all love. And your watchers on this journey are me, Princess of Power, Guido.
And me, Rabra.
You sound more like a horde villain, I'd say, than She-Ra.
Or like a kaiju, Rabra.
Yeah, that's why I think I'm going with horde villain for that one.
Well, before we enter our world of Saturday cartoons and comic books, Guido, what's happening in our little section of the multiverse?
Well, it's not that new because I'm repeating what we said last time. But I'm still reading the Nacelle book, Superman for All Kryptons, an oral history of everything about Superman. And it's really fun. It's so in-depth. As I mentioned last time, it's 700 pages, so it's sure to take me a long time. I'm now at the George Reeves television show, but going through the history of the creation and the creators and the lawsuits and the radio show and the serial. Really fascinating. Yeah, so I highly recommend it. And then Daredevil Born Again did start. We haven't seen Batman yet, but maybe we will. There's still time. Robert Pattinson's going to show up with Charlie Cox.
Well, he was just making press recently saying, well, if they don't shoot the new Batman movie soon, he'll be very old. So maybe that was all a ploy because he's actually going to be in
Daredevil Born Again. Mm-hmm. Yep, our Marvel DC crossover is taking a pause, though, for this week's episode.
Yes. And if you're joining us for the first time, we have 3 parts of our journey today: origins of the story, exploring multiversity, and pondering possibility. So thanks for coming along.
And remember, leave a 5-star review wherever you're listening. Find us on Blue Sky and Instagram at Dear Watchers.
And with that, welcome to episode 155, and let's see what's happening in the multiverse with today's alternate universe. And today we are calling on the honor of Grayskull as we answer the question, what if She-Ra was originally a female Hordak named Despara?
So this is a very specific DC Comics Earth canon that has sort of bled and intermingled with core He-Man and She-Ra canon. We'll talk, I think, a lot about canonicity in Motu and Pop this episode. We have covered He-Man first with Superman in his first comic book appearance in DC Comics way back in episode 67. So if you didn't listen back then, or even if you did, you probably forgot because it was years ago. So go back and listen to episode 67. Then with Mike from Multiverse of Badness, we covered He-Man and Thundercats, that crossover. Mm-hmm. That was in episode 93. But more recently, just last year, though it feels like 400 years ago, we interviewed Tim Sheridan, who wrote not only Alan Scott, Green Lantern Alan Scott, but also the He-Man Revolution TV show and one of the follow-up comics. So go listen to our interview with Tim, episode 127 from last year.
And yet, in all of those things, She-Ra really wasn't a big part.
We've been saving her. Well, we'll talk about why today, I think, when we get into her publication history. There's probably a reason she hasn't shown up on our show so far. And this will not be the first conversation we have about her, but it is a little bit like bleeding a rock to get some stuff. So we'll talk about that.
Well, you are a big Motu fan in general, Guido, but you're a really big She-Ra fan. So what is your background with She-Ra, Princess of Power?
Well, Motu and Pop, for those who don't know, who aren't in the know, are Masters of the Universe and Princess of Power. That's what the fan community for at least the 30 years since the advent of the internet, which probably my earliest fandom on the internet was Motu and Pop. I made a website for them. I started an episode guide. I did lots of tape trading online. So needless to say, I love He-Man and She-Ra, but She-Ra in particular is probably in my top 3 fictional characters, if I had to guess. I think it's Buffy, She-Ra, and then like X-Men, Jean Grey Rogue. So she's in top 3 to 5 characters, unquestionably. I love She-Ra. I fell in love with her on her debut in 1985. I had She-Ra action figures. I'd often have to play with them across the street at my neighbor's house because my mother didn't want my father seeing me play with dolls.
Because
Which,
for people who don't know, the She-Ra action figures were more like dolls, right? They
oh
had
yeah,
hair.
they had
They weren't
hair.
like
They
the
came with
He-Man
brushes.
figures.
They
Oh,
came
yeah,
with
yeah.
brushes. They sold clothes. I mean, yes, they were perfect. But I love the show. I've always loved the show. I love the character. I think the voice acting is perfect. I think the design is perfect. I love everything about She-Ra and always have and always will.
And
So,
what did you just buy yesterday, by the way?
yes, a mint on card, uh, Sweet Bee, my first mint on card. So as much as I've loved this series and owned it for a long time, I haven't gone back and bought the vintage figures mint on card. They're quite expensive, and I will slowly make my way through the line. Next up is the Crystal Castle in the box,
Yeah,
but
you've been
I had to
threatening
grab.
that for a while, although there's of course nowhere that it'll just sit in the basement until there's a shrine to it.
Yes, but I had to grab Sweet Bee, and there's so many others that I will eventually get. I love She-Ra. I've always loved She-Ra. I've consumed every iteration of He-Man and She-Ra, both on TV and in the books and comics, and we're going to talk about those. We're going to talk about the future. I'm a huge fan, but you're a bit younger. So what about you?
So much younger. Yeah, I was too young for the original Motu and Pop series. But the one thing I knew She-Ra from was the He-Man and She-Ra Christmas special, which I had on VHS. I'm sure I mentioned on the show before. And that I would watch every single year, usually multiple times every year. So I knew She-Ra from that, but I didn't even know her backstory. I knew she was He-Man's sister. I knew she lived in a different world from Eternia, but I didn't know the whole backstory until I think many years later, really, because it was so hard at that time to watch the original series. I wasn't doing tape trading
No,
like
and
you.
it oddly, for the level of popularity, it did not repeat for very many years after that, at least in the New York market. It was not on TV. That's part of why I had to do so much tape trading in the 90s, because they were not repeating them anymore, maybe in part because of the New Adventures
Yeah.
reboot, which you were a fan of.
Yeah, there were new He-Mans, but there wasn't really new She-Ra. Like
No,
you didn't see
we'll
see
talk
her.
about that. Nope.
So yeah, it wasn't until more recently meeting you that I really started to watch the original Filmation TV show and now into her other appearances. And I was a big fan of the Netflix She-Ra show that happened just a few years ago. That was really very good.
Yeah, she's a fantastic character.
Well, we're gonna go flitter around the fright zone for our origins of the story.
Right now, on this very show, you're going to get the answer to all your questions. Our amazing story begins a few years ago.
So here is a little background on She-Ra before we get into our first world with her. It would be completely absurd to call her a spin-off.
People do it all the time, and it's very annoying. She's not a spin-off.
She is really a partner, companion, and in some ways, according to Guido, superior show and toy line to He-Man and Masters of the Universe.
That's an objective fact.
Known as She-Ra Princess of Power, she debuts in a 1984-85 toy line and then 1985 with a television show. Her show debuts 2 months before He-Man's ends, so many Motu characters, including He-Man, continue to appear on her show for the next 2 years of original Filmation canon. Filmation being the production company that made both She-Ra and He-Man.
Yes. So She-Ra's toy line from Mattel has 2 waves, lots of fashions, and lasts until 1987, when the whole franchise at this point is being canceled. He-Man, again, has already been canceled. The original show, made by Filmation, there is no N, it's not Film Nation, it's Filmation, has 93 episodes and also lasts until 1987. She does not make it onto the New Adventures of He-Man reboot that comes a few years later.
No girls allowed.
Nor does she make it onto the 2000X reboot of He-Man, the big cartoon return. She does ultimately, as you've mentioned, have her own DreamWorks produced Netflix animated series from 2018 to 2020 that runs 52 episodes across 5 seasons. And we'll get into her publication history a little more after our first discussion.
But we're going back to Filmation, no N, with She-Ra, Princess of Power. This is season 1, episodes 1 through 5 from September 1985. These are all part of a story called The Secret of the Sword, and the individual episodes are called Into Etheria, Beast Island, She-Ra Unchained, Reunions, and Battle for Bright Moon.
And of course, The Secret of the Sword is the movie. There was a theatrical release film that edited these 5 episodes into a shorter version to debut in theaters. And of course, I saw it in movie theaters. And yeah, it's the origin. So the creative team, it's written by Larry DiTilio, who, except for episode 4, that's written by Bob Forward. Larry DiTilio worked on He-Man and Masters of the Universe, writing more episodes than anyone else, and created the She-Ra concept and the show Bible, a lot of the names, though he would not be given an on-screen credit as the show's creator, but he did have a great deal of oversight. He worked on the animated series, of course, with J. Michael Straczynski, Babylon 5 creator, and a bunch of other writers, and She-Ra had stronger canon continuity than He-Man did, and in fact had multi-part episodes, returning characters, a whole lot more going on than the He-Man world did on Masters of the Universe. The writer of that one episode, Bob Forward, was also a Motu writer and would develop Captain Planet and Legend of Zelda sequences for Super Mario Bros. Super Show and a bunch of other 90s animated television shows. So we watched these 5 episodes because they are the origin and debut of She-Ra on screen and in canon. Again, the figures were already out, and we'll talk a little bit about the comics that come with the figures, but this is her big debut. What do you think of her origin, which you'd probably only seen in bits and pieces?
I think I might have seen this once before.
Or maybe the theatrical version. I don't know that you sat down and watched all 5 episodes.
Well, to your point, I think it is actually a stronger starting point to Masters of the Universe and He-Man. Maybe you should give everyone a little synopsis as to what is actually happening.
Oh my gosh,
here.
Are there people listening who don't know? That is terrible.
But me, people know She-Ra, but they don't know her origin story.
Well, the other thing I'll point out is He-Man never has an origin story.
No, not really, yeah.
So that is really important. But in this story, we are introduced to Etheria, which is the world where the Horde are. The Horde, of course, led by Hordak, working for Horde Prime, are these evil characters that debut in the Masters of the Universe storyline through the action figures and the TV show. So we're familiar, but this is really where we start to get to know them.
A bat meets a pig meets a robot.
Yes, for sure. And so anyway, on Etheria, we discover that the Horde oppresses all the people who live on the world of Etheria. It's a different world from Eternia, where He-Man is from. As the story unfolds and we understand this oppression, we meet Force Captain Adora, one of Hordak's lead people who oversees his evil forces. However, she thinks she's doing good for Hordak and doesn't realize she's not. He-Man ends up in Eternia. The sorceress is aware of what's going on and sort of sees the future. And it turns out, of course, that She-Ra is He-Man's twin sister, taken at birth by Skeletor and Hordak, who are working together on Eternia decades ago. Hordak takes her to Etheria and imagines he's going to receive the power of Grayskull by having her there. And Shadow Weaver is keeping her under a spell, which is why she is evil. But of course, once she receives the Sword of Protection from He-Man, the twin sword to the Sword of Power that he has, she raises it in the sky and says, "For the honor of Grayskull," and becomes She-Ra. And He-Man and She-Ra fight back. They recapture Bright Moon and the castle and get Queen Angela back on the throne, and then that begins the rest of the series, which is them fighting against the Horde and trying to free the people of Etheria, and she's the leader of the Great Rebellion.
See, I think so much of what you say there too, when I was rewatching this, there's so much DNA also from Star Wars. I'm curious if they've ever really talked about that, but you've got the rebellion, you've got twin brother and sister who have been separated at birth as well. So those two elements, and I think what makes Star Wars and She-Ra bit more dynamic than He-Man and Masters of the Universe is that they are the underdogs. They are the ones that are trying to fight to save the world from the Empire, from the Horde. And in He-Man, you have Skeletor is the minority. He's trying to take over, but Eternia otherwise is pretty safe. So I think it's actually much more dynamic having the She-Ra version of that story. What do you
Yeah.
think?
Yeah, I agree. And especially in the early episodes, there's a lot about the world. I mean, He Man, there's a lot of world building for sure, but it's not being driven by one core story, which I think is what you're noticing. That in She-Ra, there is this one core story, which is the Horde versus the rebels. And the question of course, freeing an oppressed people. So it does have that bigger meta narrative going on that Star Wars has, making it more, it's almost more like a mythological story, whereas He-Man is very episodic, which is how it was designed to be. So I think that's a big difference.
And I think Hordak too, as a villain, Skeletor. I know the Skeletor version on the Filmation series is beloved, but he is such a doofus how he's portrayed there. And Hordak, I think, actually, while he is always loses the day, there's actually something more menacing and
Yeah, he's
frightening about
definitely
him.
threatening for sure. And so are his soldiers, I'd say. I think, I mean, Evil Lyn is one of my favorite characters, but Shadow Weaver is a lot scarier than Evil Lyn.
Yeah.
In part, that's what probably why I like Evil Lyn. She's a bit more of an anti-hero, whereas Shadow Weaver is just an evil, evil witch. And there are lots of characters like that on Hordak's side that are quite scary.
I think that also helps too in terms of the battle sequences, and this is certainly comes up in the comic that we're going to discuss today. But Hordak also oversees this giant robot army, while plus, and there's some mutants, but then the most of them are robots. So it really gives a lot of fodder for She-Ra because they always make a point in the cartoons to say they're robots, so they can basically blow them up, and you're
Yes.
not like blowing up a person. While in He-Man, it really is just the evil mutants, and there's not like this big other battle they can do with them.
There's even that moment in toward the end of this arc where Hordak murders one of the robots,
Yes,
basically,
yeah.
and they do it off screen, but it's really kind of surprising. Again, the Horde troopers are robots, but they have a lot of personality, and but he's disappointed in one, and he like holds his gun arm up to it, and then you cut away and you just hear the explosion.
Well, I was
So
looking in the trivia actually in one of the many reference books that you have, and originally Larry DiTilio was going to have them all be individual characters, the robots. And I don't wonder if it was because of animation or maybe because it freed them up to have these
I
bigger action
suspect it was
sequences.
better to have them be robots. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, even in these episodes, we see He-Man disguise himself as one. So it's not quite clear that they're robots at this point, but it becomes more clear as the series goes on. I think so that they can beat them up because we know She-Ra is so fascinating too. I mean, I could talk endlessly, and people do talk endlessly about her creation, but like they were not allowed to. She has a sword, but they were not allowed to let her use her sword as a weapon. So that's part of why you end up with sword to lasso, sword to shield, sword to helmet, because and really because she was a woman. Obviously, He-Man got to use his sword quite a bit. So because she was a female character, which was incredibly rare in a children's action TV show, there was a lot of concern about violence. And so she couldn't actually use her sword as a weapon. So there's just so many interesting ways that they work around the moral and ethical and sometimes regulatory aspects of having a children's TV show in 1985 at the advent of this kind of TV show.
Although even He-Man, he's never stabbing anyone with that sword. There's a
No,
lot
of
of
course not.
deflecting laser
There's
beams.
one fantastic episode where he thinks he killed someone, and it plays out pretty dramatically. But yeah.
What do you think about what is so interesting watching it, obviously from the hindsight of 2025, is how they were balancing everything's kind of pink and there's just certainly girly elements, and she rides a horse that has rainbow wings, but then there's all this battle, like, and obviously I'm thinking of like the gender stereotypes, especially of the 80s. But how did that all balance out then? Because it actually seems kind of revolutionary that you have both of those elements in a story, because
I think it
Barbie
is
certainly wasn't doing anything
No,
like that.
nor I love Gem and the Holograms.
Mhm.
There was no battles in Gem and the
No.
Holograms. I mean, I think she is a unique character. I'm sure there's other examples, but a unique children's character until you get to like Lara Croft Tomb Raider
Yeah.
a decade later.
Because also, as we've covered on this podcast with Gem and the Holograms or with Betty and Veronica, there's always a man involved there. And there's really no love interest at all. The biggest relationship is between this brother and sister, really.
Well, there is a love interest. You just haven't met Seahawk. But
Oh, yeah, I do know Seahawk comes in, but
she does have
it's
a-
secondary, certainly,
Oh,
if you
yeah.
think of Gem and the Holograms
it's not
and
the
Rio
driver
or,
for the
yeah,
show
or
in
Betty,
any
Veronica,
way.
and Archie.
No.
Yeah.
Even Bo being around her, and of course there's lots of questions about Bo's sexuality, but even if you were to imagine Bo is in love with her, like it's never a part of the narrative. It's never a driver of the narrative. So I do think it's pretty remarkable. And it's true for He-Man too. He-Man and Teela never have a flirtation, which is also pretty remarkable and stands out. It's just that Teela is a little less developed as She-Ra as a character, and certainly doesn't get as much screen time or action as She-Ra does. So I think it's pretty bold in that way. But as a character, this is your most in-depth with her. Like, what did you notice? Did you like it? Is she there? Did it grab you in these first 5 episodes? Is the fully formed She-Ra there?
Not, I think, to the same way that it grabs you, but I think what's interesting is the arc in these 5 stories of her coming to realize that basically everything that she knows has been a lie to her. And I think this is actually something that they explore in much more depth in the Netflix DreamWorks series, because of course after these 5 episodes, basically She-Ra is cured, and Adora is wants to be a hero. And I think that is something that's interestingly explored in the remake series, where there are these lingering things, there are these relationships that she still has with the characters, with these other villains that basically raised her and were her family. So I think that is, of course, not something they're really exploring on this series, but is explored in the comic we're going to discuss today, and definitely explored in the remake series.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, before we move on, let's talk She-Ra publication history, Guido.
Yeah, so we probably talked He-Man's comic book history briefly when we covered him, though that was so many years ago I frankly don't remember. But he essentially, all the toys on in these lines were packaged with mini comics. So if you're counting the mini comics, which are a version of canon, they're not always aligned to the Filmation TV show canon, but they have great creators, great art, and really establish or debut most of the characters and the mythology. So then that is where She-Ra debuts in terms of comics. After that, or beyond that, there's a He-Man DC debut miniseries that follows the issue we covered with Superman, but that predates She-Ra, so she's not in that. He-Man has a 13-issue Marvel published series under the Star Comics banner in the 80s, also has no She-Ra in it. There are some very rare UK comics that ran. They were every 2 weeks. They ran in 86 and 87, and there were both He-Man and She-Ra issues. She-Ra had a little over a dozen issues, some specials, and some annuals. They have never been collected. They are pretty unknown to most US collectors and are really hard to track down. There is one promo comic they did that adapted Secret of the Sword, and it's just a literal adaptation. in comic book panel that was given out for free. And then, of course, He-Man had a long-running newspaper strip. She's not in there either. He had a 2000s MV Creations, then Image published run. No She-Ra in that. So then DC gets the license, and after doing a few one-shots, they do a little volume miniseries and then launch their second volume, which is the first comic book debut of She-Ra in terms of proper US comics and ongoing stories. It's what we read today that is the first time that we saw her. And since this story that we read, she has not appeared anywhere else. And as we've talked about, there weren't even adaptations of the Netflix series and of her Netflix series. But in the He-Man Revelation Netflix cartoon, she's hinted at toward the very end, Stinger. And as Tim Sheridan explained to us in our interview, there's some strange She-Ra rights issues. So we haven't even seen her again on panel. But let's talk about those panels that she debuts in.
Yeah, let's call on She-Ra's best pal Glimmer to teleport us into exploring multiversity.
I am your guide through these vast new realities. Follow me and ponder the question, what if?
And today we are asking the question, what if She-Ra was originally a female Hordak named Despara? And this comes from DC Comics, He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, Volume 2. This is issues 1 through 19, so lots of books. This was from June 2013 to January 2015.
And in terms of the creators, the story kicks off by Mike Costa writing with Drew Johnson on art. But by the second issue, Keith Giffen takes over and Pop Man does the art with a ton of fill-in artists and changing
that's very
artists.
appropriate for Princess of Power.
It's true. And then toward the end of the arc that we read, Rob, David, and Lloyd Goldfine have story credits with Dan Abnett writing. So it's a lot. There is a lot of change on one title that is running over these 2 years. A bit on who these people are. Mike Costa, who maybe created the version of the character we meet today. He wrote Authority books for Wildstorm and then lots of G.I. Joe and Transformers for IDW and a good mix of Marvel. Keith Giffen, who picked it up, of course, created Justice League International, wrote a handful of Marvel books over the decades, but mostly DC in the 80s and 90s on literally dozens of titles. So famous if you don't know who he is. Dan Abnett, similarly so famous. He wrote the back end of this and is known for probably most for rebooting Guardians of the Galaxy with Andy Lanning, but has literally hundreds of credits from the 1980s at every single comic company ever, I think, through now. And then just a quick note on the story creators, Rob, David, and Lloyd Goldfine for this final arc. Really important here because Lloyd Goldfine was the showrunner on one of the later versions of TMNT and a bunch of animation projects over the last 20 years. But Rob is the vice president of Mattel Television. So he has really spearheaded the last 15 years of Motu in various ways, including the He-Man Netflix Revolution series, and wrote the Dark Horse comics that come out of that universe. So lots of connections. So we read a lot, and there's a lot happening in here that we won't even be able to summarize. Needless to say, this is a huge series. There's another 15 issues after this that wrap it up in something called the Eternity War. It's a huge series pulling on all sorts of lore that's been established as canon in He-Man. And again, canon, I mentioned this earlier, is a little complicated because you have the canon of the mini comics that came with the toys. You have the canon of the toy packages. You were a collector of card backs.
Oh, yes.
You know, those
Yep.
have little stories. You have the canon of the TV show. And then you have things like this that are telling a story that is not set in the canon of the TV show or the mini comics, but is clearly referencing it, pulling from it. And then in this case, introducing something new to it.
And you have canon the film company that made the live action He-Man
I know.
film.
Maybe one day we'll cover that movie as an alternate universe. It does not contain She-Ra, so it's not relevant today, but it's definitely worth talking about. You're right. So, again, we're not going to be able to summarize this whole thing. There's a lot going on in terms of the sorceress has just died, and Tila found out she's her mother, and then you, by the end of this arc, get Tila stepping into the role of sorceress. But as it relates to She-Ra, the important thing is we meet her, and she's a new character named Despara. So Despara is leading the Horde because Hordak has been defeated in the previous story arc, and he can't be corporeal in this dimension anymore. He's basically speaking and controlling the Horde from another place, basically as Horde Prime does in the TV series. And so Despara is leading the Horde army, and then we get a story that somewhat mirrors what we already knew. But let's pause there. What'd you think of Despara? You didn't know this going in, and I didn't tell you. So what'd you think of this idea of having her be a different character than Force Captain Adora?
Well, I think it makes sense. So first off, I think I was struck by how similar the plot was to the 5 episodes of the Filmation series that we just covered. It covers a lot of the same beats. I think it makes more sense, though, to actually give her this whole other identity, because I think if you are to steal a baby from its crib and raise it as your own, you're going to also want to give that baby a new name and a new identity. So I think actually not calling her Adora and having this whole Despara identity that's put upon her, that's all she ever knows, I think it actually makes a lot more sense for the Horde's plan.
Yeah, it does work. Also, in this case, they reference her as looking like her mother, Queen Marlena, so you need her face hidden. So putting her in this character of Despara, having a mask, not only makes her a fierce warrior who looks like Hordak, but also helps narratively with why they can fight her for so long before they start to wonder, wait a second, who is this?
And this makes also sense because when you're watching the Filmation series and she is first introduced as the Force Captain and she's leading the villains, but she just looks like a pretty blonde woman. And then there's someone with scorpion hands that she's commanding. It's like, I think the person with scorpion hands should be in charge. So this actually
Catra's a pretty black-haired woman, though.
Well, but Catra can turn into a cat.
Yes.
So she's got powers, and
Adora
is just like
powerless,
a regular person.
Okay.
So it actually makes more sense here to give her this whole mask where she basically kind of becomes somebody else. Like it makes her more scary. It makes a lot more sense why she is overseeing this group of mutants with other powers.
Especially because Adora doesn't have powers. It's only when she becomes She-Ra that she does. So you're right to point that out. I think that helps a lot. The other twist that this gives, if you will, and there's lots of subtle ones, but is that, in fact, the recognition that she has this past life, same deal, Shadow Weaver manipulates her, does the spell, but it comes from Tila. Mm-hmm. So that was a big twist that you wouldn't have seen coming. Tila met Adora when they were children growing up because Shadow Weaver would let Adora sort of visit other dimensions and worlds because she was a restless little kid. And through that, Tila and Adora developed quite a loving, close friendship. And then Adora disappeared. Mm-hmm. And so Tila thought that maybe it was actually an imaginary friend that she had constructed for so many years. And then they see each other, and that actually is what pulls Adora Despara out of the Horde army. So it's an interesting change to the mythology. You're not using the sorceress in the same way the series was, and you're not using He-Man or the Sword of Protection in the same way the series was.
And the Sword of Protection really is just a Deus Ex Machina. It's just a device then to get her to remember. So it actually makes a lot more sense if you put Tila into it, make it a person rather than just this thing that literally you snap the fingers of the sword and she remembers. This is a lot more organic.
Yeah. Well, and in part too, why we had to read so much of this series, which I'm happy to, but is you have the introduction of her as Despara, the war she's doing, she gets to Eternia and is going to take that over. And then you have her leave the army and she realizes who she is. Shadow Weaver tells her the truth, but she then goes out on her own for some time. And there's actually a few arcs in between that don't even relate to her. So it's only then, I don't know, in the continuity of the story, maybe months, but months go by and then she returns, and it's through this whole thing that has to do with King Grayskull and the history of the power of Grayskull. She ultimately kills Adam she's possessed by Despara, this like the evil side of her, kills Adam, and then she forges the sword of protection, or the sword of protection was forged and taken by a witch 1,000 years ago, and she gets it and becomes She-Ra. So it's a long arc. You're spending a lot of time with Despara and then Adora before you even get to She-Ra, which is another big difference.
Yeah, and I think reading this too, I was even thinking even more going back to Star Wars, because the idea of having her be Despara, taking on this whole other identity, wearing a black mask, it really brings to mind Darth Vader and how the Emperor makes Anakin Skywalker into a whole new person, really. And what's interesting is that this came out in 2013, well, ending in 2015, which the new Star Wars trilogy, starting with Force Awakens, doesn't happen until 2015. But I see so much of the Kylo Ren story here. And those movies are kind of a blur in my head. But like the idea of this character kind of going back and forth and having the twin that he's also interacting with in that, I saw so much of that story here, and also the black mask and all those other tropes.
Well, the other Star Wars comparison you were making earlier, I think shows up in here, which is really interesting. And what's cool about the series is clearly all of these people, maybe not Keith Giffen, but definitely once you get to Dan Abnett and we know Rob David, are huge fans of this world and loved working in it and continue to work in it. In this case, what was so interesting was you were talking about how you liked the Etheria story a little more because of its relationship to Star Wars and the fact that there's a struggle for freedom and for good versus evil that Eternia doesn't have. And I don't know if you read, I know you skimmed some of this necessarily, but there's that whole part where Hordak is talking about how He-Man, I think it's Hordak, maybe it's Shadow Weaver, is talking about how He-Man never really has to fight any battles on Eternia. Everywhere he goes is just, he goes from crisis to crisis. He doesn't know the people of Eternia. He doesn't actually know Eternia very well. Like, he just basically is deployed to fight like this one absurd crisis. It's almost a meta commentary on like the episodic nature of He-Man versus this serialized story of She-Ra. But I thought it was really interesting. And again, these are clearly fans of all of this world, and they are trying to pull in all these pieces that we are familiar with and then add their own spin on it.
And there are so many elements like that I think then you see pop up in the Netflix Revelations TV show as well, giving He-Man more depth as a character and having him question and exploring the difference between Prince Adam and He-Man. I think a lot of that comes up later on the series, so it makes a lot of sense that Rob David was also helping plot this when he was a big mastermind behind that Netflix reimagining.
Yeah, and pulling in the 1,000-year ago history of King Grayskull and what really is the power of Grayskull.
Yes,
a lot of the things that in the original series you just take for granted because they're kept really simple and straightforward. Here they get to tease out a little more. So it's a fun introduction to She-Ra. Did it make you think differently about the character reading it?
No, because I think so much of it goes back to what they did establish on the Filmation TV show. I think the bones are all still there. I think this is certainly the much more adult version. And when we were talking before about robots and people not getting killed, there's lots of references here to like, oh, half our population has been wiped out. So this is not a kid.
I don't know if you noticed, on the first page, she kills Sweepy.
Yes, I did see that.
Ironically, since I had just bought Sweepy the day before reading this.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So yeah, I think it didn't change what I thought. I think it just further cemented my thoughts around it, because it takes what we saw in this children's TV show and makes it a lot more adult and grounded.
Would you read the rest of this arc?
I don't know. I mean,
I
it's
mean, you don't read much of it. You have a big pile of things to read.
Exactly.
But imagining that you could add things to that pile, would you pursue this?
I like the world building, but it also feels kind of unruly. There was a lot going on in these 19 issues in terms of the lore. So, I don't know. That would be that's a little my hesitant.
I think my issue with this run is the inconsistency of the art.
Mm.
I think it really
Sometimes
takes
the art
away
is great,
a lot.
though.
Sometimes it's great, sometimes it's not great, and it often doesn't look the same. I mean, Pop Man ends up being the most consistent artist within it. I don't actually even love his depictions of these characters, but it also changes. There's fill-in people on books, and I don't know why at this point they're not rushing it for any reason that we know of or anything. So I have no idea why this happened, but the inconsistency of the art and maybe even the coloring is like that sort of digital 2000s 2010s era coloring I don't love. It doesn't have a lot of like the rich colors I would want from this. So yeah, I think the art stops me from loving it. The rest of the arc, I doubt we'll ever cover it. They basically bring Hordak back, and then there's this big battle with Hordak and Skeletor. They resurrect Skeletor because he's been killed, and you get lots of big battles, and then you conclude the story, and that's it. DC stops publishing at this point. Well, DC publishes a few other mini series that are completely unrelated, but they stop publishing core canon.
The art around the She-Ra character, or as Despara, is actually sometimes uncannily like Furiosa in Fury Road, which didn't come out until 2015, again when this series was ending. So I wouldn't think that George Miller was reading this
plus
comic
we know that
book.
was in production
That's
for
true.
so many
but
years.
just
so.
they even have like the black makeup around the eyes and the shaved blonde head. A few times, if you showed this to a random person and said what character this is, they would say, "Oh, that's Furiosa."
Yeah, I think that's
even again
true.
the storyline of Furiosa being the right hand person to this tyrant,
Yeah.
and then realizing, oh no, she's been lied to her whole life. It's the same storyline here.
There are a lot of similarities.
I guess that's what people say. There's only like 5 stories in the whole world, and we're just retelling them. One of them is certainly the She-Ra story.
Well, there's so infrequent times that they're being told about women, so I think that's why we see it so easily.
Well, one's Luke Skywalker, though, so close enough. Well, let's wrap up by heading back to the world of Eternia and Etheria and wondering some possibilities.
Will the future you describe be averted, averted?
Guido, what are we talking about for our pondering possibilities?
Well, we're going to talk about media in a moment, but let's start with comics. Why hasn't there been a She-Ra comic? Do you want to read a She-Ra comic? Let's talk about comics. Why is this the only arc of She-Ra, again, outside of those London comics, which are just telling little 3-page story, little 4-page stories? Should there be a She-Ra comic? Why isn't there a She-Ra comic? Do you want a She-Ra comic? Everyone knows my answer. I'm biased.
Yeah, I'm surprised there's not. I certainly think there should be a She-Ra comic.
Do you think it's just control of the license, or do you think there's a reason that it hasn't happened?
I don't know. I mean, I think there's, of course, just sexism. And I mean,
though there haven't been a ton of He-Man comics.
True,
Again,
true.
There's only pretty much 2 He-Man series that don't have She-Ra. As I mentioned, there's the Marvel from the 80s, and then there's the early 2000s MV Creations Image one. So there's not a ton of examples where they don't have She-Ra in them.
But aside from Wonder Woman, I mean, you'll know much better than I. I mean, there's not nearly as many female-fronted comic book ongoing series, right?
No, there are now more than ever, but yes, certainly historically there haven't been. So I think there should be She-Ra comics. If there was going to be additional comics, would you want them to be like the Filmation cartoons, or would you want them to be like this DC retelling?
I think like this. I think Filmation is great to watch and it is nostalgic and fun, but I don't think. Well, you know what? There could be both. There could be one, but the Filmation style ones would have to be for a young
Yeah, cartoon
audience.
style,
I
young
think that could
readers.
work if there's then
Kind
an
of like
adult
the
version.
Looney Tunes comics
Uh-huh.
that DC publishes, or the Scooby-Doo, or any of those.
So yeah, I think you kind of you could have both, but I think you definitely want an adult version in the style of this run.
So next year, 2026, we get finally Masters of the Universe live action film, the first since 1987's canon film, as you mentioned, which is not quite a He-Man film, but we'll talk about another time. So Amazon MGM Studios is producing the movie, which is shooting and has a huge cast of characters and great actors. The other thing that you might not remember is that in 2021, Amazon had announced that they were developing a live action She-Ra series
Oh,
in partnership with
Oh,
DreamWorks,
yes,
because
yeah.
DreamWorks has the license. They sold off the She-Ra license, annoyingly, though Mattel still controls the character. So don't know updates in 4 years. Don't know if that's going to happen or not. Don't know if it's going to be teased in next year's movie or not. They did say it's going to link to the movie, not to previous animated series or anything else. So what do you think about all this? Is She-Ra in the movie? Is this TV show going to happen? What do you think?
Well, and I always try to feel like I'm always pretty positive. My outlook for the movie is not super high. I mean, I'm look forward to being proven wrong, but based on some things I've seen, I'm not super optimistic about the movie. That being said, I also don't think I think it's best to, for now, to keep it as just a He-Man Masters of the Universe and keep She-Ra, because I do think in some part, as you said, it's been a long time since the movie, and it's been a long time since a lot of people even know this property. It's been, of course, had TV shows and comics, but I
40
think
years this year
yeah.
for She-Ra.
But introduce He-Man again first, maybe in the Stinger starred She-Ra, but I don't know. I think for right now it's best to like keep this be He-Man, Teela, Man at Arms, and then maybe start to hint at She-Ra. But I'm not even sure. Maybe this is still too early.
Well, I think I'm hopeful, and I'm not unreasonably hopeful, but I am hopeful about this movie. So far, the one official production shot looks fantastic with He-Man's chest and the sword. Looks perfect. The characters they've announced show that they're really leaning into what He-Man is. We were going to have the Sorceress and Fisto and Randor and Marlena and Ram Man, and so they're not shying away from it like the 87 movie did. So I'm hopeful, and I think that a She-Ra TV show that's kind of a companion, it's almost the thing that it's what the MCU would have been had streaming TV existed 15 years ago. Like, I'm almost imagining it like a WandaVision. It's like, we're going to have this movie, it's going to be this whole world, and then we're going to have this 8-episode TV series that's going to be a different part of the world, and makes so much sense here because we could have either Despara or Force Captain Adora. She works for the Horde. We meet all the Hordak Shadow Weaver characters in this TV series, and then by the end of the TV series, she realizes who she is and becomes She-Ra. And then the next He-Man movie is He-Man and She-Ra.
Now, I agree. The one issue with that, and spoiler alert if anyone wants to go in completely blind, but the rumor, well, maybe confirmed, plot for this new He-Man movie is that He-Man is living on Earth and he doesn't know who he is. He doesn't know that he's from this other world, and then he's brought back to this other world. So that is the more benign version of the She-Ra story already. So would it just feel repetitive if, oh, by the way, there's this other character who also doesn't know who she is, and she learns who she is, and now she's fighting against to
Yeah,
save
but in
her
part,
world.
if that is the plot of He-Man of the Masters of the Universe movie, it's probably to give us the fish out of water and make him also be a proxy for the audience. the She-Ra story doesn't require any of those things, because the fact that she's from Eternia and taken to Etheria, even if they were to copy that same thing, is irrelevant. Eternia and Etheria know each other exists.
Yeah.
They're similar enough worlds. It's much more about the fact that she believes the Horde is doing good, she's been brainwashed, all of those aspects. So I think you could tell the same story and not have it feel repetitive to this potential rumored He-Man being a kid living on Earth who discovers he's an Eternian prince.
Yeah, I'm wondering, we'll obviously see in 2026 when this comes out. I'm almost getting the feeling, I could be completely wrong, that they're going to borrow a lot from She-Ra and put it in this story. I'm almost thinking that instead of the Horde having taken over Etheria, we're going to see Skeletor having taken over Eternia here. I could be wrong, but I kind of think because that, as we talked about at the beginning, that ups the stakes so much. I wonder if they're going to kind of do that, because especially for a 2-hour movie, you want those stakes to be as
well,
high
also,
as
if there's
possible.
no champion, I mean, there's the Masters of the Universe, which is all of the characters, but He-Man is, of course, the strongest. The other thing you have that I guess we haven't seen a lot of this on screen, but we've barely seen in the 2000X series, really, is the origin of Skeletor, where he's Randor's brother, he's Keldor. So in theory, that could be happening on Eternia. We don't need Skeletor to be taking over the world. We could have the creation of Skeletor.
True.
And that's what brings He-Man into the play. So I think it could be good. It has really such a great cast, and I don't want to judge it because I don't know. Even though it's gone through 2 different or 3 different studios, people have sold the license, given up, moved on. But hopefully this is it, and we have the right people in charge, and we'll see it. And with that comes She-Ra.
Yes. I definitely think no matter what, it is just, of course, if the movie is a success, I think it's just a matter of time before you see She-Ra.
Yeah.
Whether she's
Sadly, if
hinted
the
at,
movie implodes,
if the matter implodes, I don't
it's
think you're ever going to
another
see
40
She-Ra.
years before we
I agree.
get these properties developed again. But anyway, so for now, Princesses of Power, that is a wrap. Dear watchers, thank you for listening. I have been the Princess of Power, Guido.
And I have been Rob Bruh.
And our reading list, viewing list is in the show notes. Follow us online, Blue Sky, Instagram at Dear Watchers.
And leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be back soon with another trip through the multiverse.
In the meantime, for the honor of Grayskull, keep pondering the possibilities.